title cards, title sequences, the way the movie displays its title. Where's the best place in a movie to display the title? The start is one possibility. I think the majority of movies probably display their title at the beginning. In decades past, it used to be the tradition that you would have an entire title credits sequence before you saw any images from the film itself. Nowadays, it's a lot more common to see just the studio logos and then just the movie's title displayed, saving the bulk of the credits for the end of the film. But there are many ways that formula can be played with. So I want to explore a particularly interesting one today. So you can display your title at the very beginning of the movie, before you've seen anything. And we've seen a few title sequences like that on this channel, where the very first thing you see is the movie's title. We've also seen a few title sequences on this channel where you get a bit of a cold open, in television terms, or you get to see some of the movie, a prologue, so to speak, and then the title is displayed. For example, we saw that with the third Pirates of the Caribbean film. So you can display the title at the start, you can display it, after a bit of a prologue. What about the end? So the end is a very interesting place to display the title of the movie, right? And in recent years, in the last decade and a half or so, it seems to me that has become more and more common. That you don't see the movie's title until the very end. The final image fades out or cuts to black, and then you get the title, and then the end credits. It's like the difference between the Batman from 2022, where the title is displayed at the start, and Batman Begins, where the title is displayed at the very end of the movie. And I think we can kind of see the logic of this with Batman Begins, right? Because that movie depicts Bruce Wayne's journey into becoming Batman. So to end the movie with that title kind of triumphantly declaring that Batman has begun, that's a decision that makes a lot of sense. So with Batman Begins, the title is the last thing we see before the end credits roll. And of course, it makes sense for Christopher Nolan to continue this pattern with the second and third films in that trilogy, so The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, also display their titles at the very end of the film. And, with The Dark Knight especially, it makes quite a lot of sense because in the final line of the film sort of declares Batman to be the Dark Knight at last, after the entire movie of sort of building up to it, and then, to display the title right there, right after we have arrived at it narratively, I think is, just, again, a choice that makes sense. So there are many movies that display the title at the end where it does make a lot of sense to do that. But I do think this trend has become, let's say, more common in Hollywood than I would personally prefer. For example, I see no reason why the title card for James Cameron's Avatar, for example, should be displayed only at the very end rather than at the beginning. But, in general, the creative decision about where in the film the title is displayed, I think it's a decision that can be approached with a lot of creative thinking. And the title sequence, the way a movie depicts the title, can be tailored for each film to kind of optimize its resonance when it shows up on screen, if that makes sense. So, title cards at the very beginning, or at the very end, or after a brief prologue. But today, I want to talk about a movie that displays its title 2/3 of the way into the film. And that film is one of my favorite films of all time. It's the film MANDY, directed by Panos Cosmatos from 2018. So, MANDY opens with a series of studio logos, as many films do, and then, instead of a title card, we're given a poem. A bit of an epigraph, if you will, introducing us to what I would say is one of the binding themes of the film. So after the epigraph, we get the film's opening credits, but the title is conspicuously absent from these opening credits. And then, at the point of the film where one might expect the title card to appear, where you might expect to see the word Mandy on the screen, instead, we're treated to something a bit more surprising. and unexpected. The Shadow Mountains, 1983 AD. So this is the first chapter card of the film Mandy. And it introduces us to basically the first act of the film. So as the audience, we're introduced to Andrea Riseborough's Mandy and Nicolas Cage's Red. We're introduced to their sort of setup, their enchanting little cabin in the woods. We're introduced to their occupations. So Mandy is a fantasy illustrator, and Red is a lumberjack. And we're introduced to the movie's atmosphere and vibe. And then a little while later, we get the second chapter card. When the movie's antagonist is introduced to us. Children of the New Dawn. So far we've had 2 title cards in this film. Then we get a series of events that basically sets us up for what the film is really going to be. It basically takes us there. And something very intense, dark, and tragic happens, prompting this sort of transformation of Nicolas Cage's character. And finally, well over the halfway mark of the film, after the film introduces us to a certain fantasy trope that it just brazenly and unabashedly embraces, which is a sequence where our hero forges himself a battle axe, finally, we are given the film's title card. Mandy. So, Mandy is one of my favorite films of all time. It's up there with Fellowship of the Ring and Pan's Labyrinth and Children of Men, as it's one of my favorite films I have ever seen. And so I think it goes without saying that I'm a fan of basically everything about Mandy. To me, it's almost as close to a perfect film as it's possible to get. And so I admire every aspect of Mandy. I admire its cinematography, its soundtrack, its atmosphere, its production design, its world building. I'm a big fan of Panos Cosmatos' vision, basically. So I think this title sequence it's one of my favorite creative uses of the concept of the title card in cinema. I love that it plays with expectations, but ultimately delivers the payoff that you expect. As the viewer, in a really potent way. It sort of teases you with your knowledge of the patterns that title cards usually follow. And instead of delivering to you the title card when you expect it, it delivers to you more information about the world of the film, this fantasy world that the film built. And, just as a side note, I do consider Mandy to be essentially a high fantasy film. I view it as a film that takes place in an entirely other world. A world completely separate to our own, that kind of abides by its own laws of physics and magic and all that. I think Panos Cosmatos has a bit of fun with that idea when he does present to us the first chapter card, The Shadow Mountains, 1983 AD, which suggests that the film takes place in our world, but I find that to be a fake-out. I think it's a very clever fake-out. So Mandy being a high fantasy film, I think it's really fitting that the movie plays with our expectations with all of these things, It's sort of showing us, as it plays with our expectations, that this film is different. It's a bit out of step with the world we're used to. The movie's actual title coming at the very moment that the film basically confirms its high fantasy-ness, if you will, confirms that it belongs to that genre. It makes sense that the film has basically arrived at a point of chrysalis. It completes its transformation into what it was always meant to be, what it was always becoming. So these are the title cards of Mandy from 2018. I just think it's brilliant, and I want to share it. So that's about all I got for this one. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye.